Well, welcome to our series on the Old Testament. And this is a in-depth study about how we got the Old Testament. That when you open up your Bible today in the Old Testament, you're looking at um, where did that come from? How did we get that? And one of the things I want to do in this series of lessons, there'll be several lessons um, in this series, is that I want to at some point put us in a certain time element with the desire to make our own copy of the Old Testament and ask the question, how am I going to make this copy? What is available for me to make a copy of the Old Testament myself? And that, of course, is assuming we had access to everything available. And I don't know if you ever thought about it that way, but the answer to that question is really interesting and it might surprise you. So, this is something that has really been on my mind. So, I thought, let's do some research, let's do some study, let's put it all together. And so, in this lesson, lesson number 1, we're really going to be focusing on the law of Moses. And one of the things I was thinking about was the law of Moses, first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy. But did the Jews, other than knowing about the other books, right, do they make mention of, like, the book of Joshua? Do they quote from the book of Judges? Do they make mention of these other books? And one of the interesting things I found is not a whole lot. Most of the focus is on the law of Moses. And so as you go through the Old Testament, through the different periods of history of God's people, you'll see them most often be reflecting, talking about, considering the law of Moses, the writing of the law of Moses, the obedience to the law of Moses, the disobedience to the law of Moses. And I find that really interesting because no doubt these first 5 books called the law of Moses, or what they consider to be the law of Moses, that was at the forefront of God's people all throughout the Old Testament history. So today we're just going to be focusing on certain elements, the writing, the copying, the reading of the Old Testament. So let's go ahead and get started with page number 1. Now, obviously, most people know, and it is pretty generally agreed, that the author of the Law of Moses, the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, is or was Moses. And there are several accounts of Moses writing. For example, Exodus 24, verse 4. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, that would be Mount Sinai, with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. So lots of references to Moses writing. 3 verses down in Exodus 24, verse 7, what Moses writes in verse 4 is now called the Book of the Covenant. And so not only does Moses write the law, write the Book of the Covenant, but look at what it says in verse 27, or verse 7, sorry. Then he took the Book of the Covenant and he read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that is in the Lord, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient to it. So here you have a reference to Moses writing what God spoke to him, putting it into a book called the Book of the Covenant, and then reading it to the people. And all the people saying they were in agreement, they're going to obey it. But we know that didn't happen. We know the people disobeyed God. They were not in agreement to obey all of his law here. So I want you to get a picture when this is all taking place. This is after the Exodus of Egypt, after the Red Sea. They're at Mount Sinai, and Moses is called up several times, and God is giving him this law, and he's writing this law down to the people. So Mount Sinai, the period of the Exodus. Now, one of the interesting things is that there's also references not only to Moses writing, but God writing. For example, again, in Exodus 24, verse 12, now the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and remain there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction. So you can see here that God is talking about the 10 commandments, those 2 stone tablets, that he is actually writing those. He's not using Moses. God, this is completely the product of God. God, it's God's words, it's God's finger. God is writing the 10 commandments. And then in Exodus 31, verse 18, again, God writing, it says, when he had finished speaking with him, Moses, upon Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. So this passage tells us clearly that these 10 commandments, these 2 stone tablets, front and back, were written by, as Moses puts it, not by his finger, not by his hand, but by the finger of God. So Moses writes, but also, at least when it comes to the 10 commandments, God physically writes those 10 commandments on those stone tablets. Now, of course, we know that these come to be replaced. We know Moses destroys these 2 stone tablets when he sees the golden calf. And so in Exodus 34, he's called back up the mountain and again given a second version, the same thing, but just a new version of these 2 stone tablets. In Exodus 32:16, and the tablets were God's work, and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets. So again, you have this reference to God writing. Staying in Exodus 32, and this time verse 32, but now, if thou wilt, forgive their sin, and if not, please blot me out from thy book which thou hast written. So here is Moses talking to God, and he references a book which God has written. Now, most people take that not as the law of Moses, but the book of life. And there might be some debate about that. But again, an emphasis that God is not just the one that speaks the word into existence. There are times where God actually does the writing. All right, again, Exodus 34, this time verse 27 and 28. Then the Lord said to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with all of Israel. And so he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights, and he did not eat bread or drink water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. Now, there might be some debate here, whether, as you see highlighted in this verse, the he should be capitalized, that God is writing on the tablets, the 10 commandments, because that's what he did first. This, of course, is the replacement copy. Or is it that in the replacement copy that Moses is actually writing on the stone tablets? My preference is that this is talking about God. God wrote it the first time with his finger. It would make sense he would do it again a second time. So let's ask this question. as the law is being written down, okay, not just the stone tablets, but all the other law we see in the book of Exodus, we see in the book of Leviticus, we're going to ask this question: where? In other words, where was the law kept? And again, I don't know if people actually think about these things, but if you have God delivering this law and this message to you, and Moses writing it down and Moses reading it to you, that's pretty important, isn't it? So where was this kept? It had to be kept, in a very secure location. Well, in Exodus 25, verse 21, and then repeated in Deuteronomy 10, verse 5, we read the following. And you shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony which I shall give to you. Now, most of the time we reference that this is talking about the Ark of the Covenant, right? On the Ark of the Covenant, there is the throne of God called the mercy seat on top. And we would reference this to be the Ten Commandments. Maybe that's all he's talking about. These two stone tablets are put in the Ark of the Covenant. That seems very clear. But what about the other parts of the law? What about the scrolls that are being written besides the stone tablets? But we really don't have anything recorded. Maybe this is a reference to, at this point in time, they were put into the Ark of the Covenant. But there is a statement about this later on in the book of Deuteronomy, and that might help us to understand where was the rest of the law. The parts of the law that were not in the stone tablets, where were those kept? So we'll hold on to that and we'll look at that. So as we are on Mount Sinai and the law is being written down and God is giving it to Moses writing it down, and as we read before, Moses then reads it to them and the people say, we will obey it. We might ask this question: what is missing? What part of the law is missing at this point? Well, I think it's quite clear that the book of Numbers, and then after that, the book of Deuteronomy, are not part of what we're talking about at this point. Those have not happened yet. We're still at Mount Sinai as the law is being given. And in fact, those books would not be written until the next 40 years. They talk about what happens after Mount Sinai. The book of Deuteronomy is kind of giving the second giving of the law before we enter into the land of Canaan, 40 years later. And so what I want you to get from this is that the law of Moses is what we might call a progressive law. That we have at Mount Sinai, we have those words of Exodus, including the command and the recording of building the tabernacle. We have the book of Leviticus and all that's contained in that, and perhaps even the book of Genesis at this point. But as we leave Mount Sinai, well, there's still more to be written. That's when Numbers comes to be recorded. And Numbers really records that wilderness wandering and why it came about in the first place. Deuteronomy, as I said, is the second giving of the law, but it actually has some new commandments and some new parts of the law that are included in the book of Deuteronomy. So much like we might think about the New Testament, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13, that the New Testament is revealed in parts, part by part by part. And that's exactly the same with the law of Moses. It's revealed progressively. And as we get through, we keep adding to it until we get to the end of Deuteronomy. And therefore, all the parts get revealed, and we can put kind of a bow, a completion bow on the law of Moses at that point. So let's look at Deuteronomy 31, 24 through 26. And part of this is going to be cut off by the screen here. I apologize to that for that. But it says, it came about that when Moses finished writing the words of this law in a book until they were complete, that Moses commanded the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, sorry about that, take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may remain there as a witness against you. So notice, this is at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And Moses, in essence, is saying, it's coming complete. This is it. This is the final, the completing of the law. And now that it's complete, he gives it to the Levites. And that makes sense that the Levites become the holders, the protectors, the ones that are responsible for this. And he tells them that they're to take these scrolls of the law and don't put it inside the Ark of the Covenant like the two tablets are inside, but to put it beside the Ark of the Covenant. Now, was it always held beside the Ark of the Covenant? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe it was held by Moses. Maybe the Levites held it. And that's kind of the interesting question as you start thinking about this. As they're moving through the wilderness and even moving, towards the promised land, who's in charge of this law? Who carries this law? Do they put in the Ark of the Covenant for safekeeping? We just don't know. It's just not recorded. But here it clearly tells us at this point, these scrolls are placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. And that kind of helps us with that idea. Where was the law kept? So when we get to Joshua 1 verse 8, this is a passage that basically tells us the law is complete. It is in its final form. We read, this book of the law should not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. So again, the law is complete, and now it needs to be used. It needs to be read, it needs to be studied, it needs to be taught, it needs to be meditated upon, and most of all, it needs to be obeyed. So we talked about the writing, or the process of God writing, Moses writing. Let's talk about this as well. There is throughout the law some references to writing. And it may not be the exact writing, the original writing of the law, but we'll explain some of this writing. Now, as we read Exodus 17, verse 14, clearly God spoke to Moses. Moses wrote it down. He is the scribe, if you will, of God, and he writes this law. Something of interest, in Numbers chapter 5, verse 23, the Levitical priest, are told to write. And specifically, they are told to write the curses of the law. And there was some type of procedure they went through to emphasize these curses of the law. So this is not the priest originating or being the scribes of the actual curses and blessings, but they were to make a copy of them in some fashion, and there was a procedure there that they were called to do, and that's kind of interesting. So the priests, in essence, were called to copy the curses. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 18, even though Israel doesn't have a physical king, God knows that one day they are going to ask for that king, and he's going to give them the king. And so kind of in preparation for that, God commands that when you have a king, each king is to make a copy of the law, and he is to read it so that that law is always on his heart as he rules God's people. So the kings were to make a copy of the law. And that's eventually what we're really interested in is when was the law copied? What kind of copies were there made? What kind of copies are in existence? And when did they come to be in existence? But we start to see these copies, and one has to wonder that when they did have these kings, many of them being disobedient to God, one has to wonder how many of these kings, if any of them, actually fulfilled Deuteronomy 17, verse 18. And then Deuteronomy chapter 27, I encourage you to read that. It's an interesting story that talks about when you go in the land. They were to go to these two mountains, Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, and one of these mountains was going to become the mountain of blessing. And they were going to read all the blessings of the law from that mountain. And one was going to be the mountain of cursing. And so they were going to read all the curses from this law, of the law. Now, in the same spot, they are told to take certain rocks and to cover them with lime and make them what we might call a limestone. And on this lime, they are to write or carve, however that worked, the copy of the law. Now, that might be just a copy of the blessings and the curses, but again, we start to see these copies being made. Well, in Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, again, Moses writing the law, completing the law. And so we do have these references to the writing of the law and the copying of the law. Now, unfortunately, these copies, like the copies the kings were to make, either were not made or they didn't survive. Archaeology, as far as my knowledge, has not uncovered any type of limestone. Of course, the years and the weather elements probably destroyed all of that. But let's talk about, not only do we want to write the law, but the law needs to be read as well. And so let's talk about some references to that. In Deuteronomy 17, verse 19, again, that's the chapter where the reigning king is to make a copy of the law, but he's also to read that law. The king is to always have that law before him and in his heart. In Deuteronomy 31, 10 through 13, the law becomes complete, right? And it's going to be placed beside the Ark of the Covenant, but it is actually read to Israel again. The complete form of the law here in Deuteronomy 31. In Joshua chapter 8, 30 through 35, a reference to Joshua reading the law to that second generation as they're about ready to go do what their parents were not willing to do, and that is to conquer the land of Canaan. And then much later, in 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 8, we have Shaphan, the scribe, actually being commanded to read the law to the people. So you'll notice there's a big gap of reading the law, at least as far as it's recorded, between Joshua's days and then the days of Shaphan the scribe in 2 Kings 22. And then there's another gap, and the next time we have recorded for us the reading of the law to the people is when the people have returned to the land of Canaan after captivity, and that's recorded in Nehemiah chapter 8, 1 through 5, where Ezra the scribe reads the law to the captives that have returned. So we do have some references, some of them with large time spans between them, and I think that makes sense that a lot of times Israel was unfaithful to God. In fact, there was a period of time where they didn't even know where the law was. It got found in the days of Josiah, and that's quite incredible that God's people don't even know where a copy of the law or the original law is. And it gets found as they start cleaning up the temple. But these are the references to the reading of the law of Moses. So let's talk a little bit about these other books. Like I said, for the most part, the law of Moses is the only part of the Old Testament that is really emphasized as far as its reading, as far as its obedience, all of that. The other books of the Old Testament, besides those first 5, they're not mentioned. They're not referenced or spoken about anywhere in the Old Testament with these exceptions. Jeremiah the prophet is talked about in Daniel 9, verse 2. He's referenced in 2 Chronicles 35 and 36. And so you would think, well, as they're talking about Jeremiah, they're talking about his words, and that would include the words that he wrote through his scribe Baruch. The prophet Micah is described or talked about or referenced in Jeremiah 26, verse 18. In 2 Kings 14, verse 25, the prophet Jonah is mentioned, not so much the book of Jonah, but the prophet Jonah is talked about. So you can see a lot of these references are the prophets. Now, when you get to 2 Kings, and you get to the period of time where Isaiah is on the scene, not only do we have Isaiah the prophet writing the book of Isaiah, but we have several references to Isaiah the prophet being the prophet of God in 2 Kings. And so there's many references to Isaiah. Again, we would reflect that as including his words as well. And then last but not least, Ezekiel 14, verse 14, verse 20, and then chapter 28, verse 3, Ezekiel talks about Daniel, he talks about Job, and he talks about, I think it's Moses. I'm going to have to look that up. That's a brain squeeze on my part. Sorry about that. But those Bible characters, specifically the one that writes Daniel and Job, are mentioned in those passages. And besides that, I was not able to find, or I have no recollection of any other books being referenced. The book of Joshua, Ruth, any of that. I think there's reference to the judges at points, but nothing specific. Now, if as you look at this and you're saying, oh, you missed this, please get in touch with me. Let me know so I can complete this. This is just my own study, and I might miss something in this series of lessons, and I would really appreciate if there's something that I didn't find, I don't include. Please let me know so that I can include it in the future. So our last slide, as we bring lesson 1 to a close, is about what I call authorship, inspiration, canonicity. And we've been focusing on the biblical books, but I think it's also important to know that the biblical books were not the only books being written in ancient times. And what is also, I think, very interesting is that the Bible makes mention of some of these other, what we would call non-biblical or non-canonical books. For example, in Joshua chapter 10, verse 13, it makes reference to the book of Yashir. In Numbers 21, verse 14, it talks about a book called the Book of the Wars. In 1 Chronicles 9 and in verse 1, talks about the Book of the Kings. And when you look at the Book of the Kings versus the biblical book, 1st and 2nd Kings, you understand this is not the biblical book. And that's the same with 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 19, the book of the Chronicles. That is not the biblical book of the Chronicles. These are non-biblical books because some of what is recorded in those books is not found in Chronicles and Kings. And so those were other books, perhaps reference books to the author of Kings, the author of Chronicles, but they make mention of these other books. And then later on in the Old Testament time, New Testament time, there's also some reference, there's also these apocryphal books. And perhaps some of them are referenced in the Old Testament. We definitely, though it's debated, seem to have some reference to these apocryphal books, just noted or just talked about in the New Testament. So what should we take from this? Well, what we should take from this is that even though these books were never considered to be part of the Bible, many of these books still were seen by God's people as being useful and profitable, and maybe in maybe all cases, maybe not all, truthful and helpful. They were books like any Christian would use. We focus on the Bible. That's our book. But to help us understand that, there are other non-biblical books, non-canonical books that we read, either devotional books or like commentaries, or just a book that kind of goes through maybe the Old Testament, New Testament, some of these biblical books. We would never say that they are canonical. We would never say that everything in them is true, but we find them useful, and they help us to understand what is written in the Bible. And a lot of these books are the same way, and that's the way that they were used by God's people, Old Testament and even in the New Testament. So that will bring a close to lesson number 1, a focus about the writing, the reading, and even the copying, as well as some of the other books, Old Testament and outside the Bible. Invite you to the Edgewood Church of Christ here in Lakeland, Florida. There's our address. There's our website. All of these video lessons we're doing are going to be on our website, and so you can check out other videos. We have different categories of these videos. We also have our Facebook page, YouTube page, and hope you'll be part of that. So love to see you at our worship services. You can find our times there, or you could connect with us online. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.